In this video, I'm going to be making two matching bedside tables inspired by a piece of furniture that I saw in an amazing shop that we found while we were away recently for a weekend in a seaside town called Margate in Kent in the UK. I talk about that shop in more detail in my latest vlog, which I'll link to in the description box if you're interested. But now, on with the project. For this project I had a long offcut of block board, which is laminated strips of what I think is poplar, with a hardcore veneer on both faces. I'm not sure what wood this veneer is, perhaps someone can tell me in the comments. This was 2440mm long, otherwise known as 8 foot. Using the dimensions of the piece of blockboard, I did a drawing in SketchUp to come up with a design, and I had just enough of the blockboard to make the tops of the bedside tables, providing of course that I didn't make any howling mistakes or bad cuts. First I measured up and cut the piece in half using my circular saw and a speed square to guide the cut. First making a scoring cut and then cutting all of the way through on the second pass. I made this cut mainly to make the pieces easier to manoeuvre in my small workshop, but also as I'm making two identical tables, it made sense to have two workpieces to work with. I'd use the table saw with my panel sled to make 45-degree mitre cuts for each panel, and the digital bevel gauge to make sure that the joints would be accurate. There's a link to this digital angle guide in the description box below. After making my first 45-degree cut, I measured and marked up the length I wanted the top and bottom panels to be. Then I flipped the workpiece and lined up the mark I'd just made with the blade, and then I made a mark level with the end of the panel onto the panel sled's fence so that I could make repeatable, consistent cuts on the other panels that I'd be cutting. Then I measured and marked up for the side panels and used the same trick again, making a mark on the fence. Once all the panels were cut to size for both tables, I could then glue up the mitre joints. I added wood glue and then I could assemble. For the first assembly I used my ratchet straps to pull the panels nice and tight together. And then I used some light clamping pressure using my F-clamps just to force the joints to where the corners looked perfect. For the second assembly, as I didn't have any more ratchet straps to use, I used masking tape to position the panels end to end. And after adding glue I could kind of fold the shape together, and I added some elastic bands to pull the joints tight, and again added a few F-clamps to get everything positioned correctly. While I was waiting for the glue to dry on those, I could start working on the legs, and for those I'd used some mahogany which I salvaged quite a while ago from a local church refurbishment, which I talked about in my first ever vlog video on my channel. After finding a couple of pieces that were roughly the right length, I used the table saw to cut the mahogany to the thickness and width that I wanted the legs to be. These thin offcuts will get used later in the project. I used my combination square to mark up the position of some tapers for the legs. And by the way, the legs I'm making here are the back legs of the bedside tables, which would be the straight ones. I cut those tapers at the bandsaw. I've made a pretty stupid mistake. What I was meant to do with these four back legs is cut them to length first, then measure and mark up with the combination square from top to bottom and mark up the taper. But I stupidly marked up the taper and then cut them at the bandsaw before I'd cut them to length. But I don't think it'll be too much of an issue. What I've done is cut them to length, so at least they're all the same length. And now I can mark up the smallest piece onto the biggest piece and just recut the tapers, and then they'll all match. Those bandsaw cuts are pretty rough, as you can see, so I'm just going to smooth those over with a hand plane. And now all of the leg tapers match up pretty well. Next I could start working on the front legs, which would need to be cut at an angle. So I adjusted my mitre saw to, I think it was 22 degrees based on my drawing, and cut off one end from each piece at that angle. Then I could mark up for a joint where the front legs would be joined to the back legs. I used my small square to reference 90 degrees from the angled cut, And then I made those cuts at the bandsaw and cleaned them up with a hand plane. And they went together well, so then I could add wood glue. I used the offcuts from cutting the 22° angle earlier to help with the glue up. So first I applied some super glue and stuck it to the front to give me 2 parallel clamping surfaces, and then I could clamp them up. And I'd work on shaping and tapering the front legs later on, but now I could get back to the mitered tops because the glue had had a few hours to set. The mitre joints wouldn't have been particularly strong at this point, so to reinforce them I'd use my splining jig. This jig really wasn't designed for such large workpieces. I only really made it for picture frames and things like that, but I could carefully hold the box against the jig and make the passes through the blade to create a kerf cut which would later hold splines. And then I measured and marked up a centre point so that I could offer that up to the blade and make a kerf cut there too. I used my calipers to measure the width of the kerf cuts, and that was just over 3mm. I locked the calipers in that position, and then I could scribe a line on a scrap piece of mahogany, set the fence so that the blade would cut the pieces the right thickness, and set up a sacrificial fence using a block of wood and some hot glue to safely cut consistently sized thin splines. I added glue and fitted the splines. Some of them needed a few taps from a mallet to seat them properly, and then I could use my Japanese pull saw to cut them off flush. I sanded everything smooth and cleaned up those splines with 120 grit, and I had to be careful here not to sand through the veneer. Back to the legs again, and now the glue had set so I could remove the clamping blocks, and here's where I regretted using super glue because it tore out the grain a little, but I later cleaned those up with a few passes on a hand plane. I also needed to flush up the faces of the leg joint, and those joints came out pretty nice. I could then cut the front legs to length, and to mark them up I used a speed square placed against the straight edge of the back legs, and then I could make those cuts at the bandsaw. I could then mark up the taper that I wanted for the front legs, and I used the bandsaw again for that before cleaning up those cuts with a handsaw again. I used my block plane to flush up the edges of the mitered tops. Then I sanded the legs at 120 grit. I also softened the corners of them just to make them nicer to touch. The next job was to cut a recess in the sides of the box to accommodate the legs. I marked up where I wanted them to be positioned and used a speed square to make sure that they were straight, and then I could trace around them. I also added some labels with a piece of tape so that I could remember which legs went with which joints, as by this point all of the tops of the legs would be slightly different sizes. Using a straight bit in my router, I cut the shape freehand. I thought about making a template here with a template following bit, but again all of the legs would be slightly different sizes, so I didn't bother. I was just careful to stay within the lines. After the first pass I wanted to go deeper, so I added a sacrificial support piece with a couple of clamps for the base of the router to run on, and then by raising the fence on the router I took 2 more passes to get the joint to the depth I wanted. Now that the bulk of the material had been removed by the router, I could refine the joints using chisels, and I kept offering up the legs so that I could see where I needed to do more chiselling until I had a good fit for each of the legs. I then did a quick dry fit to see how they would look, and at this point I decided it would be good to add a bevel to the top of the legs. So after making some marks with a pencil, I used a block plane to add the bevel. I worked inwards from both sides here to avoid tearing out the grain. And then I sanded those bevels smooth and they looked pretty good. I applied glue to the joints, added the legs, and then I added a clamp just loosely initially, and then used the mallet to hit the top and force the joints nice and tight. Then I could fully tighten the clamps. How about that for one of the easiest glue ups ever? I scraped and wiped away the glue squeeze out with a damp cloth. Remember those mahogany offcuts from earlier? I could use those to trim the front edges of the tabletops. I just needed to cut them to width at the table saw first to match the thickness of the block board. And then I glued them in place and held them with some masking tape. Once the glue had set, I could cut them to length. And then I used my block plane to get the edges flush and add a slight bevel. I used a knife blade to scrape away the old finish from the trim pieces. And then I did some sanding with 120 grit. I also added a gentle round over to the bottom of the legs to help prevent grain tear out if these ever get dragged around the floor. I added my maker's mark to the bottom of the bedside tables. Then I blew away any dust with my air blower and I was ready to apply finish, and for that I'd use some of this clear water-based varnish. I brushed on the first coat, being careful to take care of any drips. Those who watch my channel regularly will know that I usually choose spray varnish for projects like this, but I knew I wouldn't be able to spray the inside of the bedside tables. Maybe I should have applied finish to the panels before I assembled them. After a couple of hours it was dry and ready for a second coat, but first I sprayed on a little water and wet sanded gently with some 400 grit wet and dry paper to denib the finish. And then I brushed on a second coat. I later wet sanded again in the same way as before and added a third coat, and I was really happy with the finish. The final job was to level the legs and remove any wobble. I used my table saw table as a reference for flatness, and after checking that with a spirit level, I could level the legs using my electric file to remove any wobble. This project took 2 days in total to complete, and I'm really pleased with how they turned out. It's the first time in a while that I've used a brush-on finish, and it came out really nice. I'll definitely be using this varnish again. In terms of things that I would do differently if I were to make this project again, shortly after I finished this project I watched a video by Jay Bates where he made a desk using some Bubinga, and he mentioned that before applying a water-based finish he wets the grain with a damp cloth to raise the grain and then sands that back and then applies the water-based finish. I think that's a really good idea, and I'll be trying that in future, because the problem with the first coat of water-based varnish is that it raises the grain and then you have to sand back the varnish. I should imagine it's much easier to raise the grain just using water and then sand that back and then apply the varnish, and that would give you a much smoother coat. So that's something I'll be trying out in future. These bedside tables are now available for sale via my Etsy store, link to that in the description box below, and I'll also put together some full plans and a detailed cut list for this project, which will be available via my Patreon page, link to that below too. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe if you haven't already for more weekly woodworking videos, and thanks for watching.